Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we are going to discuss ethical issues in social research. This is part of the module on social research methods. As we all know that social research involves interactions with other human beings. In a way, one of the ways of looking at social research is the interaction between human beings with other human beings. And naturally, since human beings are reflexive animals, they have brains, they have a mind, and they react to stimuli, and they can think, they can respond back. All these qualities of human beings naturally would mean that we are surrounded with, rather we are submerged with a set of ethical questions. In this module, we are going to look at some of these ethical questions. Now, the way we will proceed about this module is as follows. First, we will look at the ethical issues that crop up, rather that animate the relationship between the researcher and the researched. Secondly, we will look at ethical issues surrounding the researcher and his or her peers. Thirdly, we will look at ethical issues between the researcher and the funding agencies or the sponsors. Next, we will look at ethical issues that crop up between the researcher and the public. And lastly, we will conclude by giving you a set of arguments and the key themes that we would have discussed in this module. Among social researchers, there is no unanimity about the place of ethical issues in research. There are a large number of researchers who think that we should not be paying much attention to ethical issues. What should rather take priority is our intellectual, academic, and cognitive contribution. Sociologists like Talcott Parsons and Edward Shields, they belong to this tradition. In fact, Edward Shields would argue that in case of social research, since the stimuli that we inflict on our research subjects is transient in nature, it's rather ephemeral, and it does not have lasting impression on them. So in that sense, we should not be bothered too much about the ethical implications of social research. Unlike biological sciences, medical sciences, and the research in the area of biotechnology, many social researchers believe that in social sciences, generally we do not have much harm to the researched. In that case, we should not be bothered about the ethical implications of social research. What should rather take priority, as I have said earlier, is the contribution that we can make. Even otherwise, modern societies cannot work objectively unless we get a set of objective data from the citizen participants. However, there are many others who would say that the days of amoral professionalism is passé. Now we cannot pretend that we are engaged in doing objective research, and our moral values, our ideological convictions, our own politics, these things are immaterial to the type of research we engage in or the type of research we do. In that sense, there are two categorical views vis-a-vis the place of ethics in relation to social research. On the one hand, we have a group of researchers who would rather pay scant attention to ethical issues, arguing, rather claiming that the objective rigor of science would take care of the ethical issues. On the other hand, there are researchers who would say that those days where science could have that epistemological privilege is over, those days are over, so we should rather focus on ethical implications. There is no point trying to seek shelter, take refuge under the objective claims of modern science. In the next module, the next segment of this module, now given this lack of unanimity among the researchers, we are going to talk about the relationship between the researcher and the research. In general, this relationship is premised on two major issues. The first is that we should always try to take informed consent from the researched. The idea is that we should not be engaged in any deception, any act of deception. We should not be misleading them. we should not be misrepresenting the purpose of our research. We should keep everything transparent. We should make everything transparent to the researched so that they are aware since the day one about the goals of our research. So in this case, the informed consent is the key idea underlying the relationship between the researcher and the researched. The second issue, which is of crucial importance so far as the relationship between the researcher and the researched is concerned, is that of the possibility of collective injury to research participants. We should not be engaged in any such research act which somehow, in real terms or even potentially, inflict any sort of collective injury to the research participants. In fact, there are 6 forbidden processes in the conduct of social research. I am going to enlist all these 6 processes one by one. The first is coercion, which means exercise of undue pressure to induce a subject to be part of the research. Number 2 is deception, or misleading the subject on what the research is all about. The third is invasion of privacy, or intrusion into matters that the subject would rather keep to himself or herself. The fourth issue is breach of confidentiality, or permitting information about individual subjects to be passed to others. The fifth is stress, the psychological difficulties that participation in a research may cause to the research participants. And the last one, as I have said earlier, is collective injury, that is the risks and the harms that a research might cause to others beyond the individual subject, herself and himself. In general, most of the researchers should go by these 6 forbidden acts while engaged in the research. Unfortunately, in India, the lack of ethical awareness persists. You would be surprised to find that most of the professional associations in our country, they do not have an ethical code of conduct. Unlike many US universities where they have an ethical review board, an ethical institutional review board rather, in India, we do not have a process where our research proposals get rated by these ethical institutional review boards. So in that sense, ethics becomes a matter of choice of individual researchers. The point I am trying to communicate to you is this, that so far we have failed to institutionalize a system where ethical issues, or rather awareness about ethical issues, is part of the institutional research protocols at the collective level, at the institutional level. Unfortunately, we have miles to go. Now in this segment, we are going to talk about the relationship between the researcher and the peer. There are many issues of crucial importance which crop up here. The first thing is that the issue of plagiarism. Plagiarism is ultimately an ethical issue, and the plagiarism is something which is part of not only any researcher that one has to take care of this issue, but it's something which is also part of the larger institutional academic culture. In fact, there have been cases where it has been found out that many doctoral dissertations have been plagiarized, and some of these cases have even reached the court. Not only that, there are some cases where the plagiarism has also marred the reputation of some of the universities and research institutes. Like, for example, the Vice Chancellor of University of Mysore few years back went on record saying that 2 of the faculty members of the university have tried to gain fake postdoctoral degrees from some nondescript universities in the US. Similarly, few years back, there was a major controversy about plagiarism in the pages of the Hindu, the national newspaper, where a researcher from MITS, Chennai, had accused another British researcher how that British researcher had copied some of the papers. So what I am trying to say is that some of the minute details of how to give references, how to paraphrase, how to cite others, all these things are not in a way things which are of ordinary importance. All these issues, minor details, have major bearing on something called plagiarism, which is ultimately decided by the community of scientific researchers, the community of peers. So in that sense, ethical issues are not something which should bother only doctoral researchers or postdoctoral researchers. Ethical issues should be part and parcel of any research endeavor. Next, and since most of us do social science research and we cannot afford to claim the type of objectivity that scientific researchers can pretend to claim, or rather they always pretend, we deal with animate world, we do not deal with inanimate world. Coming back to the relationship between the researcher and his or her peer, the most important issue is that of plagiarism. The minute everyday details of any research endeavor like footnoting, giving quotations, paraphrasing, citations, many other things have a bearing on something called plagiarism. According to many researchers, peer review is seen as one of the effective ways of addressing ethical concerns in social research. However, peer review as an instrument of ensuring ethical propriety or ethical integrity of the researcher has certain limitations. The major limitation is that peers can look at the ethical conduct only from the perspective of the scientific community. They have no way of ensuring ethical conduct from the perspective of the public or the perspective of the other stakeholders. Even otherwise, peer review has certain other limitations. It does not address the issue of plagiarism or the issues of academic impropriety in large number of cases. Otherwise, we would not encounter so many academic controversies day in and day out in newspapers and in public mass media. I will just give you two instances. One, as I was referring to earlier, that one British scholar was caught plagiarizing the research paper written by a social scientist based at MITS Chennai. Secondly, two of the faculty members of the University of Mysore were allegedly seen to have got fake postdoctoral degrees from nondescript US universities. So even otherwise, most of the well-established scholars, since they have become academic stars or they have established a scholarly reputation in their respective fields, they generally do not undergo the same rigor of academic scrutiny as novice researchers or academic researchers who are new in the field would undergo. Given all that, peer review may not be an effective way of addressing all the ethical concerns that we have raised. We are just trying to hint at that it could be one of the possible ways of addressing some of the concerns, but not all the concerns that ethical issues in social research throws up. Next, I move on to the relationship between the researcher and the funding organizations or the sponsoring organizations. These days, as you know, much of research funding comes from many other agencies, international NGOs, corporates, and many other such charitable foundations. They may have their own covert or overt research agendas. And since revenue generation or money generation has its own ways of bringing pressures on the researchers, it's likely that most of the researchers may end up towing the line of the funding organizations which have contributed to their research. Now, there are no well-established ways of tackling this issue of how to ensure that sponsoring agencies do not set the research agenda. They may give you the money, but ultimately the research agenda, the setting of research agenda is the prerogative of the individual researcher or the group of researchers. Now, the question is not merely that of money. There are other ideological issues which come into play. Like some of these funding organizations may belong to some of the economic or political ideologies of the day. So naturally, the research agenda that you may pursue, you may follow, would have to cater to those economic and political ideologies that your sponsoring organizations have been part of. Just to give you an illustration, Rajiv Gandhi Foundation in Delhi, everyone knows is part of the Indian National Congress. It may not be the technical part of Indian National Congress, but more or less it has intimate relationship with the Indian National Congress. And if as a social science researcher, if as an independent social science researcher, you undertake some research study sponsored by Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, it would be expected of you that your research outcome, your research findings would generally support the ideology of the Congress. If it does not, then there may be other implications, and it has happened in the case of Rajiv Gandhi Foundation. That's why I have picked up Rajiv Gandhi Foundation. In fact, the director of the Rajiv Gandhi Institute of Contemporary Studies, Vivek Debroy, who is now the member of deputy chairman or the member of the Niti Aayog, he had to resign because one of his research paper talked about the developmental outcomes in Gujarat, which were not in sync with what the Congress party, then Congress party, would have liked to believe. And this led to a situation where after a time or so, after a lag of 1 or 2 years, he had to ultimately quit from his post in Rajiv Gandhi Institute of Contemporary Studies. So next, if you look at, and all these things, the type of problems that I am trying to enlist, you would realize that all these problems crop up because both of us, both the parties, we as researchers and those with whom we interact, the researched, both of us live in the same society, both of us share certain values, both of us have a set of individual set of convictions, political ideologies, and both of us act and react on each other's responses. And that's why the problems galore. And that's why social researchers cannot merely escape by just going on chanting the mantras of scientific research. In fact, social research cannot escape the social responsibility that it brings to bear on individual researchers. And that's why another issue that we have discussed in this module is the relationship between the researcher and the public at large. As you know, that social science research has historically been raising issues which may confront the common sense of a given public, which may in fact unsettle some of the deeply cherished values that they have historically held. In that case, it can lead to public hue and cry. Many cases, it has led to violence. You all may have heard of the way some of the Shiv Sainiks had ransacked the offices of Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute in Pune because there was this biography of Shivaji, and some of the issues which were raised in that biography, more so about Shivaji's parentage, those things were not liked by the Shiv Sainiks, and Shivaji being an icon, his followers were naturally on the streets and they ransacked. Very recently, you may have heard the story of one of the books being published by Oxford University Press being pulped because it talked about Hinduism in a way which many Hindus felt does not do justice to what they think Hinduism is all about. And you can give on illustrations like the controversy about Samrat Ashoka or Chandragupta Maurya or any such historical icons about whom you write, and if your writing does not gel well with the dominant public opinion, it may end up in controversies, it may end up in some sort of violence. In that sense, when we talk about ethical issues in social research, we are not merely confining ourselves to the domain of so-called scientific research. You would have seen that I have taken out the researcher-research relationship to various other domains, the relationship between the researcher and the public, the researcher and their sponsors, the researcher and the peers, those who form part of the scientific community. Very recently, Benedict Anderson, the great historian who had worked on Indonesia, he passed away. And in fact, as an historian, his work was so much hated by the dictator Suharto that he had to be declared out of bounds of Indonesia, and he could never go back to Indonesia to carry on with his research. So this is just an illustration of how social research can also lead you to such situation where you may also get expelled from some of the countries, where you may also be declared out of bounds and things like that. Lastly, I am just trying to leave you with two cases, and these cases are part of the textbooks. Any textbook that you pick up in the domain of social research method, you will come across these two illustrations. and I leave these illustrations with you, and I want you to look at the ethical aspects of what the researchers did in both the cases, and you will have to look for your own individual answers. There are no categorical answers that I can offer you in both the situations. Answers have to be yours. The first, what is known as Milgram experiment. You know, there was a famous psychologist, Stanley Milgram. He conducted an experiment where there were two rooms. In one part of the room, which the others could not see, he was trying to administer electric shock to a group of research subjects. And in the adjoining room, there were other group of people who were supposed to react to the electric shock being administered in the other room. What Milgram had done, and he wanted to look into issues of obedience and things like that. That is not our concern here. What Milgram did is that he did not tell one group about what other groups were being done to. That is, he never told the people who were in the other room that electric shock is actually not being administered. He just pretended that electric shock is being observed. And then his work led to the famous theory on obedience in social psychology. Now, this misrepresentation of research, what is called as Milgram experiment, for some researchers who care for ethics, this amounts to deception. I want to leave this with you, that would you regard this as deception, or would you think that in the larger interest of the intellectual contribution to the domain of social psychology, this was required, and that's why Milgram should not be charged with ethical impropriety. I will leave you with another illustration, and again this is the famous one. It's called tea room trade. And again, here is the case, very briefly, of a researcher who wanted to look into the life of homosexuals. So what he did was that he would go to all the public toilets, watch the homosexual behavior, try to identify the people, and when these people were getting into their cars, he would note down the registration numbers of their cars, and then would go and visit their houses. And that's how he conducted this research, and he called it tea room trade. Now, going by the 6 of the big no's that I have enumerated, the 6 things that we as social researchers should take care of, this amounts to clear-cut case of invasion of privacy. This is breach of confidentiality. On no ethical parameter, this can be seen as an ethical research. But even then, tea room trade is seen as a classic work. It's seen as a classic book. So how do you look at this? The two cases that I have just given you, just to repeat, Milgram experiment and the tea room trade, these are apparently unethical pieces of research work. But at the same time, these are also the works which have contributed immensely to their respective fields. So now, ultimately, we have to weigh two options. As individual researchers, we have to make our own personal decisions that in what way we can at times go for ethical compromise in the larger interest of trying to contribute something meaningful to the research, to the academic domain that we belong to. But there can be no hard and fast rule governing our ethical conduct as a researcher, because rules have their own problems. At times you can have rules which would be too general, too vague, and there can be no guide for action. If you try to go for a very detailed, meticulous set of rules, then it would be too constraining for you as a researcher, because as individual researchers, you go to different settings, your research questions are different, and no uniform set of ethical rules can give you the ultimate answer to the ethical dilemmas that you may face as individual researchers. So the point is, and I am going to conclude, that no textbook, no research paper, no teacher or professor can give you the ultimate answer that what should be the ultimate ethical act that you should be doing when you are undertaking your research. What we can do at most is that we can tell you that ethics is as important a part of social research as methodological rigor or the robustness of different instruments that you use in your social research, and it's this ethical awareness which should be part of the toolkit of each and every researcher. And the another thing that I would like to draw your attention to, that ethical aspect or other ethical aspects should not be seen as mere add-ons to the process of research. Unfortunately, if you read the textbooks, if you look at the modules, ethical issues come in the last, as if it's an afterthought, as if it's an add-on. The point we're trying to say is that ethical research, gone are the days when we can afford to put ethical research as an add-on. Ethical awareness should be an inalienable part of the very process of research, and it should not be seen as an add-on. Rather, it's value addition. And it's in this process, it's in this struggle between two different types of orientation, what I earlier called a moral professionalism, where the robustness of data instruments is privileged, and at the other end we have this too much of ethical awareness lapsing into some sort of cultural relativism, which does not help us much. So somehow we have to negotiate our way as individual researchers between these two extremes of a moral professionalism and ethical relativism. That's all. Thank you.